Morgan Freeman confronts a racist talk show host. His response leaves the audience speechless. We dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of February. Subscribe to the channel and be part of this dream too. The bright lights of the television studio illuminated the glossy black stage, reflecting the grandeur expected from the Real America show, a talk show notorious for its controversial takes on race, culture, and politics. Tonight's special guest was none other than Morgan Freeman, a legend in the entertainment industry, known not only for his commanding voice but also for his unwavering stance on dignity, respect, and the power of knowledge. The audience buzzed with anticipation, some excited to hear his wisdom, others skeptical about how he would handle the sharp tongue of James Whitmore, the show's host. Whitmore, a middle-aged conservative provocateur, prided himself on his ability to rattle his guests, particularly those who advocated for racial equity. He leaned back in his leather chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his lips as the cameras rolled. Whitmore wasted no time diving into controversy. Morgan, let's be honest. We live in an America where everyone has the same opportunities. Yet we still hear complaints about racism, about systemic oppression. People like you, successful, powerful. Aren't you proof that all of this so-called racial injustice is just an excuse for failure? His voice carried a deliberate sharpness, designed to provoke, to poke, to undermine. The audience sat in silence, waiting to see how Morgan would respond. But the veteran actor did not react with anger or defensiveness. Instead, he took a deep breath, his fingers resting lightly on the arm of his chair. His deep, steady gaze met Whitmore's, and in that moment, it was clear Morgan Freeman had come prepared. The silence stretched thick and charged. The host shifted slightly, as if expecting a knee-jerk reaction, but Morgan simply let the tension breathe. Finally, his voice, rich and measured, filled the studio. James, let me ask you something. Have you ever stood at the bottom of a staircase and been told that you must climb to the top, while someone else starts halfway up? Would you call it an equal race? The host scoffed but said nothing, as murmurs rippled through the audience. Opportunity is not about presence alone. It's about accessibility, about barriers unseen to those who never had to face them. You see, James, the issue isn't whether people of color can succeed. It's what they have to endure to do so. A flicker of unease passed through Whitmore's eyes, but he quickly masked it with a condescending chuckle. Come on, Morgan. That's a tired argument. You've made it. You have wealth, fame, influence. How can you claim that America isn't fair when you've benefited from it so much? His tone was smug, as though he had already won. But Morgan Freeman was not here to play a game. He was here to dismantle an illusion. He leaned forward slightly, his presence commanding without force. James, I didn't succeed because America is fair. I succeeded despite the obstacles. And that is the difference. His words hung in the air like a challenge, daring the host and the world to look deeper. The tension in the studio thickened like a storm brewing in slow motion. The audience was riveted, some leaning forward, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Whitmore, used to controlling the narrative, adjusted his tie, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. He wasn't expecting Morgan Freeman to be this calm, this composed. His usual tactics, mockery, deflection, and arrogance, had worked on countless guests before. But something about Morgan's unwavering presence made it clear. This was no ordinary debate. You say you succeeded despite the obstacles. Whitmore pressed, flashing a rehearsed smirk. But doesn't that prove my point? If there were true systemic barriers, you wouldn't be here today. The problem isn't racism, it's victimhood. The more we tell people they're oppressed, the more they believe it. Maybe if they stopped playing the victim, they'd be as successful as you. His voice was sharp, designed to provoke, to extract an emotional response. Morgan Freeman remained still, his expression unreadable. Then, ever so slightly, he tilted his head, the corners of his lips curving into the faintest of smiles. It wasn't amusement, it was understanding. He had heard this argument before, from men like Whitmore, men who confused privilege with merit, ignorance with wisdom. He allowed the silence to stretch just a bit longer before finally responding. James, he he said, his voice like smooth granite. If a man is drowning and you stand on the shore telling him to just swim, does that make you wise? Or does it make you blind to the weight of the chains around his ankles? The metaphor landed with a thud. A few members of the audience nodded, murmurs rippling through the crowd. Whitmore's smirk faltered for half a second before he forced out a laugh. Come on, Morgan. You're making it sound like people are shackled in this country. Last I checked, this isn't 1860. Morgan leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked onto Whitmore's. And yet, James, the remnants of 1860 shaped the lives of millions today. Do you think a wound disappears just because the bleeding stops? The scar remains. The pain remains. And pretending it doesn't exist doesn't heal it. He paused, his gaze unwavering. Tell me, James, if your ancestors had been denied education, land, and opportunity for generations, and you were told to simply work harder, do you think your starting line would be the same as mine? Whitmore chuckled, shaking his head. Oh, please. I come from nothing. My father worked 2 jobs just to put food on the table. Are you telling me I had privilege? Morgan smiled again, but this time it was a different kind of smile. One that carried a lifetime of experience of battles fought and won. Privilege isn't about what you've struggled through, James. It's about what you haven't had to struggle against. The audience erupted into applause. Whitmore opened his mouth to speak, but for the first time in his career, he found himself at a loss for words. The applause lingered for a few seconds before Whitmore lifted a hand to silence the audience. His usual cocky demeanor had taken a hit, but he wasn't ready to surrender. He thrived on confrontation, on twisting words to fit his narrative. And yet, something about Morgan Freeman's quiet confidence unsettled him. He had debated politicians, activists, and intellectuals before, but Morgan wasn't trying to win an argument. He was revealing a truth too powerful to ignore. Whitmore leaned in, his eyes narrowing. Morgan, you talk about privilege as if it's some invisible force controlling our lives. But at the end of the day, success comes down to choices. If someone grows up poor, they can work harder. If someone faces discrimination, they can prove people wrong. Isn't that what you did? You didn't let racism hold you back, so why should anyone else? His voice had a smug edge, as if he had just delivered an unshakable truth. Morgan let out a slow breath. His fingers tapped gently on the arm of his chair, a rhythm of thoughtfulness rather than impatience. He had encountered this mindset before, the belief that individual perseverance could erase generations of systemic oppression. He didn't respond with anger or frustration. Instead, he chose something far more powerful, clarity. James, let me tell you a story, Morgan said, his voice softer now, drawing the audience in. Imagine 2 runners preparing for a race. One of them trains on an open track with the best coaches, the best equipment, and all the time in the world. The other? He's forced to run on rocky terrain, barefoot, carrying weights on his back. When the race begins, who do you think will win? Whitmore rolled his eyes. Oh, come on. Life isn't a race. Morgan's eyes sharpened. Isn't it? Isn't success, opportunity, and progress all about where we start and what obstacles we face? You see, James, telling someone to just work harder without acknowledging the burdens they carry isn't wisdom. It's willful blindness. The audience was silent now, hanging on to every word. Whitmore shifted in his seat, his confidence slipping. But people have overcome, he insisted, grasping for control. Look at you. Look at Oprah, Barack Obama. If America were as unfair as you claim, none of you would be where you are today. Morgan nodded, his expression calm. And yet, James, for every one of us, there are thousands who never got the chance. Not because they weren't talented, not because they didn't work hard, but because the system wasn't built to let them through. He let his words settle before adding, success stories should inspire us, yes, but they should also remind us of how many others were left behind. That's the difference between acknowledging privilege and pretending it doesn't exist. For the first time, Whitmore had no comeback. The audience erupted once more, this time with an energy that made the walls of the studio tremble. Morgan Freeman hadn't just won an argument. He had opened a door to a truth that could no longer be ignored. The thunderous applause filled the studio, But Morgan Freeman remained composed, his presence grounded in wisdom rather than spectacle. Across from him, James Whitmore attempted to mask his frustration, but the cracks were beginning to show. His confidence, so meticulously crafted over years of hosting the Real America show, was faltering. He was used to controlling the conversation, steering it in his favor with cutting remarks and loaded questions. But tonight was different. Tonight, he was facing a man who did not argue. He illuminated. The host forced a tight smile and leaned forward. "Morgan, I can see that you're passionate about this. And, of course, we can all agree that history wasn't perfect. But let's talk about now. Don't you think that constantly talking about race just keeps us divided? People succeed when they stop focusing on the past and just move forward." He gestured toward the audience as if seeking validation, but the response was subdued. The crowd, once easily swayed by his rhetoric, was now skeptical, questioning. Morgan tilted his head slightly, his gaze unflinching. "James, ignoring history doesn't make it disappear. It makes us repeat it." His voice was calm, yet firm, carrying the weight of experience. "You ask why we still talk about race. I'll tell you why. Because when a black child is more likely to go to an underfunded school than a white child, we still have work to do. Because when job applications with ethnic-sounding names are rejected at higher rates, we still have work to do. Because when people like you say racism is in the past while benefiting from the privileges it left behind, we still have work to do." A hush fell over the studio. Whitmore's usual composure cracked for the first time. He shifted in his seat, glancing at the audience, sensing the shift in the room. His grip tightened on his cue cards as he searched for a way to regain control. "But Morgan," he pressed, his voice laced with forced laughter, "if we keep focusing on race, doesn't that just fuel resentment? Don't you think it's time to move on?" Morgan Freeman exhaled slowly. Then, with the effortless grace of a man who had lived through more history than most could comprehend, he leaned forward. "James, let me ask you something. If your house were on fire, and I stood outside saying, 'Let's not talk about the fire. Let's just move forward,' would that put out the flames?" The audience erupted in applause, louder and more forceful than before. Whitmore swallowed hard, his practiced confidence slipping through his fingers. He opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time in his career, words failed him. Morgan continued, his voice steady, his presence unwavering. "Moving forward isn't about pretending problems don't exist. It's about fixing them, acknowledging them, and ensuring that the next generation doesn't have to fight the same battles we did." The camera zoomed in on Whitmore's face. His smirk was gone, his bravado shattered. He had spent years dominating debates, silencing guests, and spinning narratives. But tonight, something remarkable had happened. The audience wasn't just entertained, they were awakened. Whitmore cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly in his chair. "Well, Morgan, I think we'll have to agree to disagree." Morgan Freeman smiled, not in victory, but in quiet understanding. He knew he hadn't just won an argument. He had planted a seed that, if nurtured, could grow into something bigger than any debate, a real change in perspective. The director signaled for a commercial break, but the energy in the room lingered. The audience wasn't just watching a television show. They were witnessing a turning point. Morgan Freeman sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He had spoken his truth. Now it was up to the world to listen. The studio buzzed with an energy that refused to dissipate. Even as the cameras cut to commercial, the audience remained locked in place, whispering among themselves. Some exchanged glances of realization. Others sat deep in thought, their preconceived notions shaken. This wasn't just another episode of the Real America show. This was something else entirely, a moment they would remember. James Whitmore, however, wasn't ready to concede. As the stage crew rushed around preparing for the next segment, he turned to Morgan Freeman, his voice lower but still laced with defiance. "You know, Morgan, you've got a way with words. But at the end of the day, people will believe what they want to believe." His smile was tight, forced. "And my audience, our audience, they don't like being told they're wrong." Morgan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Truth doesn't need to be liked, James. It just needs to be heard." Before Whitmore could respond, the stage manager gave the final countdown, and the cameras blinked back to life. The bright lights returned, and the host straightened his posture, slipping effortlessly back into his polished persona. "Welcome back to the Real America Show," he announced, his voice steady but lacking its usual bite. "We're here with Hollywood legend Morgan Freeman, and we've been having quite the discussion." The audience chuckled, some nervously, others with genuine amusement. Morgan merely nodded, waiting. Whitmore cleared his throat, forcing a casual tone. "Now, Morgan, before the break, we talked about race in America. But let's shift gears a little. You're a man of incredible success. Award-winning actor, philanthropist. If you could give one piece of advice to young people, regardless of race, what would it be?" It was a strategic pivot, an attempt to steer the conversation away from the uncomfortable truths that had just been exposed. But Morgan Freeman wasn't easily redirected. He took a moment, letting the weight of the question settle. Then, in his signature steady voice, he answered, "I tell them this: know your worth. Don't let the world define you by its limitations. They'll tell you what you can't do, what you shouldn't reach for, and what you don't deserve. But none of that is real." His eyes scanned the audience, connecting with them on a level beyond words. "The truth is, the world doesn't change because we ignore the hard conversations. It changes when we face them, when we refuse to accept just the way things are." The audience remained silent, absorbing every syllable. Whitmore hesitated, then forced a chuckle. "So, no excuses, right?" He grinned, trying to regain control. Morgan met his gaze, unwavering. "No ignorance, James." The silence that followed was deafening. Whitmore shifted, his mask slipping once again. He had played this game for years, twisting words, dodging accountability. But tonight, in front of millions, he had finally been outmatched. The show was his. But the moment? The moment belonged to Morgan Freeman. James Whitmore took a measured breath, his hands resting stiffly on the desk in front of him. He could feel it, his grip on the conversation slipping, the weight of Morgan Freeman's words settling over the room like a thick fog. He had expected an easy debate, a few fiery soundbites for his audience to cheer or jeer at. What he got instead was something far more dangerous: truth. And worse, truth spoken in a way that could not be dismissed. The cameras were still rolling, and there was no escape. He adjusted his tie, forcing a chuckle. "All right, Morgan, I'll give you that. You know how to deliver a message. But let's talk about solutions. We can debate history and race all day. But what's the answer? What do you suggest we do, huh? Reparations? Special treatment?" His tone was mocking, as if daring Morgan to suggest something controversial that he could twist into a headline. Morgan did not take the bait. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze unwavering. "James, the solution isn't about handouts. It's about accountability." His voice was steady, deliberate. "It's about acknowledging the past so that we can fix the present. You say we should move on from racism, but tell me, how do you move on from a wound that's still bleeding?" The audience murmured, a ripple of agreement spreading through the studio. Whitmore shifted, a flicker of frustration in his eyes. Morgan continued, "If a house is built on a crooked foundation, you don't ignore the cracks, you rebuild. Education, fair wages, equal opportunities, a justice system that isn't skewed. That's not special treatment, James. That's justice." Whitmore let out a sharp laugh. "Justice? Come on, Morgan. You're talking about government intervention, quotas, all of that. What happened to personal responsibility? Hard work? Pulling yourself up by your bootstraps?" Morgan's expression remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. "Tell me, James, what happens when you don't have boots to begin with?" The audience gasped. A few clapped. Whitmore froze, his mouth slightly open as if trying to summon a retort, but nothing came. Morgan's voice softened, but the impact of his words deepened. "No one is saying hard work doesn't matter. No one is saying personal responsibility doesn't count. But to pretend that everyone starts at the same place? That's not reality. That's a fantasy built by those who've never had to start from nothing." The audience erupted into applause. This time it wasn't scattered. It was thunderous, rolling through the room like a tidal wave. Whitmore's fingers tightened on his cue cards. This wasn't going the way he had planned. Morgan leaned forward slightly, looking Whitmore directly in the eyes. "James, the real question isn't whether racism still exists. The real question is, why are so many people afraid to admit that it does? The applause swelled again. The host's face darkened. He had spent his career avoiding that question. And now, on his own show, in front of millions, he had no choice but to face it. For the first time, James Whitmore was speechless. James Whitmore's grip on his cue cards tightened, the edges curling under the pressure of his fingers. He had never been in this position before, outmaneuvered on his own show, unable to spin the conversation in his favor. The cameras were rolling, the audience was against him, and worst of all, Morgan Freeman wasn't playing his game. The moment stretched, the silence in the studio amplifying the weight of Morgan's words. Whitmore finally let out a sharp breath, attempting to regain his footing. "All right, Morgan," he said, plastering on a forced smile, "so let's assume you're right. Let's assume racism still lingers in society. What do you suggest? Do we keep apologizing for the past? Do we keep dividing people by race? Or do we finally move forward and focus on what unites us instead of what separates us?" It was an old tactic, a well-rehearsed deflection designed to frame any discussion on racial justice as a call for division. But Morgan Freeman saw right through it. Morgan took a moment, his deep brown eyes scanning the audience, making sure every person in the room was with him. Then, he turned back to Whitmore. His voice, rich and steady, filled the space with the ease of a man who had nothing to prove, only truth to speak. "James, unity isn't pretending our wounds don't exist. It's healing them. You don't build a stronger house by ignoring the cracks in the foundation. You fix them, and you don't fix them by telling people to just get over it. You fix them by recognizing why those cracks were there in the first place." The audience erupted again, this time louder, more energized. People were nodding, some even standing. Whitmore forced another chuckle, but it sounded thin, weak. "So what, Morgan? We rewrite history? We make white people feel guilty for things they had nothing to do with?" Morgan sighed. He had seen this argument before, time and time again. A desperate grasp at victimhood by those who had never truly known oppression. But he wasn't here to scold, nor to shame. He was here to enlighten. "Nobody is asking anyone to feel guilty, James," Morgan said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of lived experience. "Guilt is useless. It changes nothing. But awareness? Action? That changes everything." Whitmore opened his mouth, but Morgan wasn't finished. "You see, James, the real problem isn't history. It's denial. If we can acknowledge the past and understand how it shaped the present, then we can build a better future. But pretending the playing field is even when it's not, that's not unity. That's a lie." The crowd erupted into applause once again, this time with an intensity that shook the studio. Whitmore sat frozen, his eyes darting across the room. He was losing them. His audience, the people who came here to be reassured, not challenged, were slipping through his fingers. For the first time, James Whitmore looked uncertain. And Morgan Freeman? He simply leaned back in his chair, knowing that the most dangerous thing to those who peddle ignorance is not anger. It is truth. James Whitmore shifted in his chair, his forced confidence now showing visible cracks. The energy in the room had changed. His audience, once a predictable crowd nodding along to his carefully curated rhetoric, was now engaged in a way he had never seen before. Some leaned forward, their brows furrowed in thought, while others whispered to their neighbors, processing every word Morgan Freeman had spoken. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had expected pushback, sure. He had debated politicians, activists, even scholars before. But this was different. Morgan Freeman wasn't debating. He was teaching. And worst of all, people were listening. Whitmore inhaled deeply, searching for a way to reclaim control. "All right, Morgan," he said, feigning composure. "You've made your case. But let me ask you this. What do you say to the people who believe that constantly talking about race just makes things worse? That if we stop bringing it up, the problem will go away on its own?" Morgan let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "James, ignoring a wound doesn't heal it. It festers." He turned slightly toward the audience, his voice resonating with an authority that was impossible to ignore. "The people who say we should stop talking about race aren't the ones suffering because of it. They're the ones who have the luxury of pretending it's not there. The audience burst into applause, louder this time, as if something inside them had snapped into place. Whitmore clenched his jaw, feeling the momentum slipping further from his grasp. Morgan continued, his voice steady and deliberate. You wouldn't tell a sick man to stop talking about his symptoms, would you? No. You'd listen. You'd diagnose. And then you'd treat the disease. That's how progress happens. Not by silence. Not by pretending. But by facing the truth. Whitmore exhaled through his nose, his fingers tapping impatiently against the table. He had to regain control. Somehow. Fine, he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. But let me ask you something, Morgan. Don't you think that constantly framing things through the lens of race just breeds resentment? Doesn't it make people angry? Morgan's expression didn't change. James, he said, his voice as calm as ever, people aren't angry because we talk about racism. They're angry because racism still exists. The room erupted again. Whitmore flinched at the sound, realizing he had just walked into another trap of his own making. He had framed the issue as if the discussion of race was the problem, when in reality, it was the very injustice itself that fueled the frustration. Morgan leaned forward slightly, his gaze locked onto Whitmore's. The only people who get uncomfortable talking about racism, he said, are the ones who don't have to deal with it. Another round of applause. Louder this time, more people standing. The tide had shifted completely. Whitmore sat back in his chair, his usual bravado now replaced with something unfamiliar. It wasn't defeat, not yet, but it was doubt. For the first time in his career, James Whitmore wasn't sure if he was the one leading the conversation anymore. And that terrified him. The weight of the moment hung thick in the air. James Whitmore sat stiffly, gripping the edges of his desk, his knuckles whitening under the pressure. He was losing his audience, and he knew it. The applause, the nodding heads, the murmurs of agreement. None of it was for him anymore. It was for Morgan Freeman, the legend, the man who had walked into the Real America show and turned it into something Whitmore could no longer control. But Whitmore wasn't the kind to back down. Not yet. Not while the cameras were still rolling. He forced a tight smile, his mind racing for a way to salvage the situation. Well, Morgan, you've certainly got away with words, he said, his tone laced with forced amusement. But let's be real here. At some point, doesn't personal responsibility play a role? I mean, sure, history has its scars, but we all have choices. Plenty of people, yourself included, have overcome obstacles without blaming society. So, isn't it time people stop making excuses? A murmur rippled through the crowd. A few heads nodded, but they were outnumbered by those who frowned in thought. The energy had shifted, and Whitmore felt it. His words no longer carried the same weight they once did. Morgan Freeman, however, remained as composed as ever. He sighed, not in frustration, but in the quiet understanding of a man who had heard this argument too many times before. James, he said, his voice low but powerful, personal responsibility is important. No one is denying that. But let's talk about reality. Tell me, if two people start a race, and one of them has hurdles in front of them while the other has a clear path, do they have the same chance of winning? Whitmore's lips parted, but no words came. Morgan continued. You see, James, people like to talk about personal responsibility when it suits them. But when it comes to acknowledging systemic responsibility, suddenly, they want to change the subject. The audience erupted again, this time not just in applause, but in something deeper. Realization. Whitmore's smile faltered. His usual tactics, deflection, condescension, smug laughter, weren't working. His arguments, which had once felt ironclad, were unraveling under the weight of a simple, undeniable truth. Morgan Freeman was not here to argue. He was here to reveal. Whitmore cleared his throat, grasping for anything to regain control. Well, Morgan, I think we'll just have to agree to disagree. Morgan leaned back slightly, a knowing glint in his eyes. James, truth isn't something you agree or disagree with. It just is. Another explosion of applause. Whitmore felt his stomach twist. He had lost. And worse, the whole world had just watched it happen. The weight of the conversation pressed heavily on James Whitmore's shoulders. He was drowning, And he knew it. His usual defenses, sarcasm, deflection, misdirection, had all failed him. Every attempt to spin the conversation in his favor had been dismantled, not with anger or aggression, but with calm, undeniable truth. And the audience had seen it. Whitmore sat back, trying to mask his discomfort with a smirk. "All right, Morgan," he said, his voice thinner than before. "I think we've had quite the discussion tonight. You've certainly given us a lot to think about." Morgan Freeman, unshaken, simply nodded. "That was the goal, James." The audience chuckled, light-hearted, but with an undertone of something deeper. A realization. A shift. Whitmore forced a laugh, but it didn't land. His grip on the conversation, on the show, on his own audience had slipped entirely. But he wasn't ready to walk away just yet. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together as if he were about to deliver some profound closing statement. "At the end of the day, Morgan, isn't it better to just focus on what unites us instead of what divides us?" A final attempt to reclaim the narrative. A desperate plea to return to the comfort of vague, feel-good rhetoric. Morgan Freeman smiled. Not a condescending smile. Not a victorious one. Just the smile of a man who had heard these words before, time and time again. "James," he said, his voice smooth and unwavering, "unity isn't built on silence. It's built on understanding." The audience remained silent, hanging on every syllable. "We don't move forward by pretending problems don't exist," Morgan continued. "We move forward by fixing them, by facing them, by refusing to let history repeat itself. That's not division, James. That's progress." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the first clap, and another, and another. Within seconds, the entire studio was on its feet, the applause crashing over them like a tidal wave. Whitmore swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room. His audience, his people, were no longer looking to him for guidance. They were looking to Morgan. He had lost, and Morgan Freeman had never even raised his voice. The applause didn't die down as quickly as James Whitmore hoped. It thundered through the studio, lingering in the air like a final verdict. The audience had made their decision, not in words, not in argument, but in undeniable, unanimous support for the truth that had just been laid bare. For the first time in his career, Whitmore felt something he had never experienced on his own show: irrelevance. The cameras were still rolling, the bright studio lights illuminating his discomfort. He shifted in his chair, forcing another one of his signature smirks, but it no longer carried the same power. It was empty now, a mask with no purpose. "Well, Morgan," he said, clearing his throat, "I think it's safe to say this has been one of our more spirited discussions." The forced laughter that followed was met with silence. No polite chuckles from the audience. No camaraderie. Just stillness. Morgan Freeman, ever composed, merely inclined his head. "I'd say it was an honest discussion, James." Whitmore swallowed hard. He was running out of time. His show was built on control, on his ability to steer the conversation in his favor. But this was a spectacle he had no power over. And the worst part? He had invited it into his own domain. He forced a tight smile. "Well, Morgan, we'll have to agree to disagree." Morgan's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, his eyes sharp, unwavering. "James, the truth doesn't require agreement. It just is." A final wave of applause washed over the studio. Whitmore clenched his jaw, feeling his show, his brand, slip through his fingers. He was used to walking away from these debates unscathed, his narrative intact, his audience reassured. But tonight, something had changed. The audience wasn't just listening. They were thinking, and that terrified him. The stage manager gave him the wrap-up signal, but for the first time, Whitmore wasn't sure how to close. He had spent years crafting a persona of dominance, of control, of always having the last word. But what do you say when the last word has already been spoken? Morgan Freeman sat back, his posture relaxed, his presence effortless. He had done what he came to do, not to win, not to argue, but to shift the perspective. As the cameras cut to the closing credits, James Whitmore remained in his chair, his smirk fading into something else. Something foreign, something uncomfortable. Doubt. The red live indicator on the cameras flickered off. The show had ended, But the moment had not. The audience remained in their seats, murmuring among themselves. Some were replaying Morgan Freeman's words in their minds, letting the weight of them settle. Others glanced at James Whitmore, as if realizing, for the first time, that the man they had followed for so long had no real answers. Whitmore exhaled sharply, peeling off his earpiece. He could feel the tension in the room, the subtle shift in power. He had never lost control of an interview before, not like this. Usually, the show ended with him confidently shaking hands, knowing he had reinforced his message, his truth. But tonight, his narrative had unraveled right before his eyes. Morgan Freeman stood up, adjusting the cuff of his jacket. There was no gloating, no smugness, just quiet confidence. He turned to Whitmore, offering a firm handshake. "Thank you for the conversation, James." Whitmore hesitated, then shook his hand. It was a formality, nothing more, but even that felt like a concession. Morgan turned to the audience, giving them a nod of gratitude. The applause started slowly but grew into a standing ovation. Not for theatrics, not for entertainment, but for something far greater. For truth. Whitmore watched as Morgan walked off the stage, his presence lingering even after he had disappeared behind the curtain. The audience began to file out, but their energy was different. They weren't just leaving a talk show. They were leaving with something more, an idea, a revelation, a shift in perspective that would not be easily undone. Whitmore sat back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his jaw. He had spent years curating his audience, feeding them the same recycled narratives. And yet, in just under an hour, Morgan Freeman had planted seeds of doubt in the very foundation of what he had built. For the first time in his career, Whitmore wasn't sure what would happen next. His show would continue. His audience would return. But would they ever see him the same way again? He wasn't so sure. As the studio emptied and the lights dimmed, Whitmore sat alone at his desk, staring into the darkened space where Morgan Freeman had been just moments ago. He had brought a legend onto his show, expecting an easy debate. Instead, he had witnessed the quiet dismantling of a lie. And deep down, James Whitmore knew. The truth had won. If you made it this far, comment where you're watching from and let us know if the story of justice moved you.